thank you both, Peter Oborne and Craig Murray, for joining me on the Crispin Flintoff Show. How are you doing, Peter?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm just back from the Middle East, where I spent some time in the West Bank, in Jordan, and in East Jerusalem.
And Craig, you're still in the Middle East. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm still here in Beirut, still getting out and about around Lebanon, but I'm on good form.
You've been doing some fantastic reporting from Lebanon, Craig. I hope that you haven't got a drone hovering above your head at the moment.
Strangely enough, for the first time for weeks, there doesn't seem to be one there this morning.
Wow, that's pretty scary. Well, look, it's great you're both here. I know lots of people are interested to hear what you think about what's happened in the past week, and that's why I wanted to hear you both. I'll just play a short clip of Trump with Netanyahu, so as a refresher.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
Now, Craig, what's your take on what he says? I mean, I noted from a tweet that you made that you point out that he's reading an auto cue, so it's not unscripted.
Yeah, it's not so much an auto cue, I think, as paper notes on the lectern, but he is reading for much of it. He reads a bit, then he looks up, and then he goes extempore a bit, then he goes back to his script and reads again. But very plainly, at different points in that, he's definitely reading. So the line that's being put out, but all his aides were shocked and no one knew he was going to say it, I just don't buy. Somebody wrote the script that he is reading. This was a considered move, and that means that I also don't buy that Netanyahu had no idea he was going to say it before he said it, because that wouldn't be done. As I say, that this is something which they've cooked up between them. I mean, obviously, it's completely illegal. That goes without saying. You can't just take over somebody else's place. The Gaza Strip is not legally part of Israel. I think it's very important to say that. So Israel has no right to give it away to the United States, and the United States has no right to take it. So, I mean, many of us have suspected all the while that the aim of Israel, supported by the United States this entire time, has been to remove most of the population from the Gaza Strip and to annex the Gaza Strip, and also to annex the West Bank. And I think this is simply another stage in that process. It doesn't mean that there's an imminent US occupation looming, but I think it's a plain indication that that's the way this is all going.
How do you see this, Peter?
Well, it does explain why the following day, I think it was, that President Trump announced he was putting sanctions on the International Criminal Court, because, as Craig's just pointed out, this kind of, what he's talking about here is forced movement of people, ethnic cleansing, and that is against international law. And let's remember that we had there in that conversation a convicted felon on 34 counts, talking to somebody who's wanted for alleged war crimes. It's quite a horrific little conversation that going on in the White House.
Yeah, I mean the whole way that it's been drawn out from the start, with bombing the whole of Gaza, flattening it, and then this ceasefire. I mean, and then this announcement, it just seems so planned. Do you think it's all been coordinated?
I do think that Craig's absolutely right when he's a former diplomat, Craig Murray, and he does understand how these conversations are created, and the fact that Trump was reading from a statement, I haven't liked this sort of discourse in Washington and in London saying, look, this is just they're playing around, they're flooding, to quote Steve Bannon, they're flooding the zone with shit. That this is very serious, and it's a direct threat to Palestinians. It's quite clearly they're planning to smash the rule of law, to break the law, and it is interesting. It is also an existential threat to Israel's neighbors all around.
Right. I mean, this is something I wanted to pick up with both of you. But firstly, Craig, I noted a tweet that you put out on this, sort of the day of Trump's announcement there. I'll just show that. I woke up to hear that Trump announced the US will annex Gaza and the population will be deported. The West Bank will be annexed in the next month by Israel. Any Arab regime which goes along with this will be overthrown. This is going to result in huge unrest and bloodshed. It also puts the mealy-mouthed Zionist governments of Europe into a huge dilemma. They'll have to face the destabilizing consequences of their support for genocide. Do you want to speak a bit more about what you mean about the destabilizing effect that will have?
I mean, the Trump and his government are putting huge pressure on Arab states, are putting huge pressure on Egypt and Jordan to accept the deportation of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. And the idea would be to starve them out. The idea would be that you continue to prevent shelter and food getting into Gaza in particular. And you reach the stage where people are so close to death that they will voluntarily, in inverted commas, walk into the Sinai Desert where there would be food prepared. But the Egyptian government can't do that. Sisi's coat's already on a Shughli peg, and the reaction against that within Egypt would be enormous. And the same in Jordan, where if the king were to accept more forcible removals out of the West Bank, the destabilizing effect of that on Jordan would be amazing, and there would be knock-on effects across the Arab regimes. But I'd also like to refer to what's happening in Lebanon, because yesterday was an extraordinary day in Lebanon. In the last 36 hours, we've had the most intense Israeli bombing since the ceasefire. The Israelis have told the Lebanese government it wants them to agree to Israel not withdrawing on the 18th of February and retaining fortified military outposts within southern Lebanon. And when the Lebanese government didn't agree, they intensified the bombing and said, this is what happens when you don't cooperate with us. And at the same time, the new US envoy to the Middle East, this lady with an extraordinary name, I can't recall her name off the top of my head, she turned up and she said that it's a red line for the United States. They cannot accept that Hezbollah will form a part of the government. And Hezbollah and their allies are, by a long way, the largest political party in Lebanon. And it would put the country back into civil war to exclude them entirely from access to governance. And she praised Israel. She said, in the Lebanese presidential palace, she praised Israel and said she congratulated Israel on its defeat of Hezbollah. This is resulting in riots here in Beirut last night. This is massively destabilizing, and Lebanon's being destabilized, and the pressure which the United States is exerting on Egypt and Jordan and other states and the Gulf states to go along with its plans is going to destabilize those states. I think people aren't sufficiently aware of how close we are to the Middle East really going up in flames in a way that makes what's happened in Gaza seem like a sideshow.
Wow. I mean, Peter, I'd just like to show that you've written an article with Richard Sarnes, Jordan ready for war with Israel if Palestinians are expelled into its territory. Trump's call to clear out Gaza has sparked anger in Amman, with well-placed sources telling Middle East Eye that the US ally is prepared for war. The first paragraphs that read, Jordan is ready to declare war on Israel in the event that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempts to forcibly expel Palestinians into its territory. Middle East Eye understands. The warning comes in the wake of repeated statements from US President Donald Trump that he would like to see Jordan and Egypt take in Palestinians as part of a move to clean out the Gaza Strip. Well-placed sources in Amman and Jerusalem told MEE that the last thing Jordan wants is war and is eager for a peaceful solution, but they're adamant that the Jordanians will close the border if refugees begin to cross into the country. Could you tell us more about what you've seen in Jordan and heard in Jordan?
Well, Jordan is facing, realizes that it is facing an existential crisis that, that it's not. They cannot accept hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinian refugees. They've already got a massive water shortages. Already there are big tensions inside the country, and they're appalled by what they see happening because they're next door on the East Bank. They're seeing what's happening on the West Bank, the ethnic cleansing going on there, and they don't want to go to war. I mean, they've played this sort of balancing trick for years, but I understand, and I think it's been repeated. I haven't seen it by by the foreign minister, although I don't want to swear to that they are ready to declare war to stop it happening. Now, they're not under any illusion that they would win that war. They know that Israel has got far better military capacity. But an Israel victory will mean that, or would mean, that the border, it's 500 kilometer border, 10 times longer than Gaza, that will turn into an open border. It's very hard to, at the moment it's policed by Jordan. It provides security to Israel in many ways. And once that border becomes an open border, much of it is mountainous and remote, pretty well impossible to police, then that border will fill up with fighters coming in from Iraq, Iran, perhaps Saudi, etc. This is the message they're wanting, I think, to be heard, that it will destabilize Israel's western frontier. If the next point to add, by the way, which is something neither Craig or I have had time to, is that the United States has slashed aid or cut aid entirely, and a very poor country like Jordan depends on that aid. It's already, in the case of Jordan, been taken away, and that is going to lead to massive discontent and difficulties. And I suppose that Trump, when King Abdullah goes to the United States next week, goes to the White House, may try to blackmail him. Say, look, if you want your aid back, you're going to have to let in Palestinians. So it's a very difficult. So this conversation, which is coming up in a few days' time, I think it's on Tuesday, is going to be a very difficult and stressful one for the King of Jordan.
Wow. So this, I mean, as you were saying, Craig, the whole region could be, you said, set on fire. I mean, the Saudi Arabia's, what have they been saying about Trump stuff?
The Saudis came out with a fairly definite rejection of it and said, as they've been saying consistently since Gaza started, they reiterated that there's not going to be any normalization of relations with Israel without firm commitment to or progress towards a two-state solution. The Saudi regime itself is not very trustworthy. It has its own agenda, which is about integrating itself further into Western financial systems and achieving a kind of Western respectability, I guess, by means of sports washing and pop washing and all all kinds of washing of its image, and to some extent of its social dynamic. But the getting Saudi to normalize with Israel is important to Trump, as it's kind of, he's very proud of his Abraham Accords initiative, and that's the kind of main measure of success of that. That's what would enable him to say, I really transformed the Middle East. But Saudi Arabia itself, the Saudi regime is, I think, less stable than people think. It has it keeps people happy by money, effectively, but the events in Gaza have caused. We always talk about the Arab street and the difference in view between the average Arab and their rulers, and nothing much usually actually ever comes of that. But I think that difference has become vastly strained by events in Gaza, and I think also the Sunni Shia divide has become vastly strained, with it being the Shia countries have been the only ones who've made any kind of military or quasi-military attempt to assist the Palestinians. And that's difficult for the Saudis because they have a large Shia minority in the south.
Right. Now, sorry, Peter, I'm interested to hear what you think about the media reporting of Trump's announcement. I mean, you said that they kind of they're making out this isn't as serious as it is. What do you think of the media's reports?
Well, it's very silly, really. What the interpretation of what's going on is from Washington is very much a sort of Beltway clever Dick analysis that Trump is trying to just sort of baffle everybody, playing around. I don't see this at all. I think you've got to take him seriously and look at the consequences, not just for the Middle East, by the way, everywhere. I mean, it reminds me historically of the 1930s, because that's when we saw the withdrawal of the United States from the world stage and the collapse of the League of Nations. Now, and that led to World War II. Now, we're seeing something like that at the moment from the United States, which is basically largely, I think, partly in order to please Israel, turning its firepower, I mean, its financial and political and diplomatic firepower, that is, on the ICC, on the United Nations, the successor body to the League of Nations, and destroying the world order, and in creating a new system where might is right. America has been an empire for a long time, but it's always governed or sought to govern more with the velvet glove than the iron fist. And they've torn off the velvet gloves. They've got rid of the rule of law. As Craig was discussing, they're legitimizing just sort of land grabs, and not just, of course, in the Middle East. We're looking at what they're doing Trump is talking about in Greenland and in Canada. And so it's a return to the law of the jungle and the destruction, quite deliberate by Trump, of the international order. In the Middle East, I think it's terrible, potentially. It's in an area which has already lived through the most awful normally US-inflicted nightmares, but also across the rest of the world.
Now, Craig, I'm interested to hear what you think about what Pete said about the US sort of throwing away the rules-based order, the UN and the International Criminal Court being sanctioned. How damaging is that? I mean, you're committed to those institutions, aren't you?
Yes, I think they they stand between the world and anarchy, anarchy in a bad way. And in part, I mean, what Trump has done is he's accelerated a process that already was underway. The United States has never signed up to the International Criminal Court or allowed its people to be tried there. And the United States has made many claims of universal jurisdiction, where it basically claims that United States law trumps either people's domestic legislation or international law all around the globe. And there are many examples of overreach, and the case of Julian Assange was one example of a United States assertion of universal jurisdiction. So what Trump does in many ways is say out loud what the United States, to a large extent, has been doing or trending towards for a long while. I agree he's a more naked and open abuser of that kind of power, but it is a power which the United States has been abusing for a long time. One of the things that fascinates me about it is that the United States is doing this, where by any objective measure, it's getting to the stage where its time as the greatest power in the world is limited, and China is going to become the greatest power in the world shortly. And I don't put an exact measure on that. It'd be hard to know when the exact moment is anyway, but we are, I think, on the cusp of China becoming the dominant world power, which many would think is a very strange time to throw away the rules-based order and insist that being the dominant power is the only important thing. And the extent to which China steps into some of the power vacuums which the United States has created. Again, just to give a little example here in Lebanon, the Chinese offered all kinds of money for infrastructure projects here in Lebanon, for tunnels through to the Bekaa Valley, through Mount Lebanon, for port and dock developments, for a railway line down the coast. And the United States has been blocking Lebanon from accepting that Chinese aid. And the United States has itself been giving a lot of aid. Now that the United States is stopping giving a lot of aid, countries like Lebanon might be looking at the Chinese financial offers with more enthusiasm. China has the ability now to both take over as the major financial support of many economies in the global south, and also to position itself as the state which stands for international law. If the Chinese are smart on their feet, this could be a key moment. Trump could actually be losing the United States a lot of influence, but not gaining it.
Right. I mean, can I just want to move on a little bit because I'm aware of the time. Craig, I'm so inspired by what you're doing, and something that you showed me that you've done in the past few days that's come to fruition. Was this letter from the United Nations, 4 special rapporteurs to the UK government regarding the misuse of terrorism legislation to silence journalists. I'll just show the front page. It's quite a long document. I won't go into it all, but this is the front page of the document, and then as you can see, this is a letter. We have the honour to address you in our capacity as a special reporter on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And then you mentioned this in this paragraph. Powers under counter-terrorism legislation have been used on multiple occasions to examine, detain and arrest journalists and activists, particularly at the UK border. It's alleged that journalists and activists who are critical of Western foreign policy in the context of the conflict in the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war were especially affected by the reported misuse of these powers. In particular, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000 and Schedule 3 of the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Act 2019 have been used to examine and obtain data from journalists and activists, including Joanna Ross Ganyunkova, John Lauchland, Kit Clarenberg, Craig Murray and Richard Medhurst in circumstances where they appear to have no credible connection to terrorist or hostile activity. Furthermore, Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000 has been used to charge journalists and activists including Richard Barnard and Richard Medhurst, for allegedly expressing support for prescribed organisation in the course of activism and media reporting. You're right that this has been published, because there was no response from Keir Starmer to this letter of censure. Can you tell us the background to it? How you got this off the ground? What your role was in it?
Yeah, we started by wanting to take a complaint when I myself was detained under the Terrorism Act back about 15, 16 months ago. And then I discovered that several other people, who were all people I knew, in fact, had also been detained under the Terrorism Act in quite extraordinary circumstances where none of us conceivably has any connection to terrorism at all. And the power to detain people at ports where they have no, what the Americans would call Miranda rights at all under the Act. If you're detained at a port, you have no right to remain silent, you have no right to a lawyer. You must give up all your laptops and phones and all the passwords to them. And the justification when that was put through Parliament was it's for use at airports against people who have just planted a bomb on a plane. That's why they don't have the right to remain silent. That was the justification given to Parliament for this extraordinary power, which only applies at airports. But the police worked out that, or the Home Office worked out, that they could use it against journalists and then have them there with no rights at all, and activists, and make them give up all their contacts without a warrant, give up all of their devices, all of the passwords to their devices, and force them to answer questions, because refusing to answer a question, it brings you up to 2 years in jail. Not handing over the passwords to your devices brings you up to 5 years in jail. So these amazing powers were being abused. And there's an interesting thing. You know, John Lockland is a Brexit supporter. That was the activism he was, which had brought him to the notice of the police, and they were attempting, I think, to find some link between him and Russia to show that the Russians were paying Brexit supporters, but they was totally, and I should say that there was no evidence of that whatsoever, and the guy, as courts subsequently found, was totally innocent. But increasingly, of course, it's being used against pro-Palestinian supporters in order to try to tie them to links with Hamas or to foreign funding or whatever. But this is an extremely sinister abuse, because it's using a power which is meant to stop terrorists against journalists and people who just genuinely have no connection to terrorism whatsoever. And I'm delighted the UN has taken it up. And these special rapporteurs who have written include Irene Khan, the special rapporteur on freedom of expression, and Ben Saul, the special rapporteur on terrorism. Those are heavyweight figures, but they are serious people.
Why would Starmer not respond to that? Is that something that you expected he wouldn't respond to?
Yeah, I must admit, I'm not surprised. The UK used to always take part in UN activities, and you know that if the UN wrote to the UK on a point, and you have 60 days to respond. If you don't respond, the letter's published. The UK used to take the UN seriously. We are going down the Trump road of just ignoring international institutions when we don't like what they say, which is very bad. I'd be very interested to hear Peter's viewpoint on all of it.
Well, there you go, Peter. I don't have to do anything. Over to you.
Well, yeah, I was one of the things which has been really upsetting about the coverage of the whole Gaza situation and human rights has been the silence of the mainstream British media, which claims to support free speech, but hasn't, as far as I don't think I've seen any mainstream writer or journalist stand up for the large number of journalists who've now been quite stopped at airports or at various ports, etc. And this omerta from the British media about the threat to their ability to go and do their jobs, and also the kind of the freedom of colleagues is beyond belief. It's mimicked, by the way, by the total indifference, as far as I can see, with a tiny number of exceptions, to the slaughter of journalists inside Gaza itself. I think the latest number I saw, and there are various different ways of counting, was 159. Many of them have been targeted, and their families have been targeted. The courage of these people is quite incredible, bringing the stories from Gaza, and the contempt by the mainstream British media and also by the government. I mean, do you remember that hideous comment by Lamy, the foreign secretary? There are no journalists in Gaza. That was the ultimate. People talk about dehumanizing Palestinians, which of course goes on all the time, but actually to deny they existed at all, when everything we've learned about the slaughter in Gaza over the last 18 months, 15 months, has come thanks to the incredibly brave work done by our colleagues out there. And so, yes, I think it's very important the UN has intervened.
And the idea that, you're both suggesting that the US doesn't really regard the UN with any seriousness. It seems like the UK is doing the same, as you suggested, Craig. But one other thing, just before you go, that we've seen arrests on the continent in Europe. We saw Ali Abunimar of Electronic Intifada, and just I think yesterday Richard Medhurst was arrested and all his equipment seized. Is there a link between the British intelligence, the US intelligence, and these European intelligence units? Are they all in this sort of stamping down on any talk of Gaza and genocide and stuff like that, Craig?
Very much so, yeah. And I got no doubt that these cases happening in Switzerland and Austria in closely linked to one another, and of course the Ali Abunimar, who was arrested in Switzerland, works with Asa Winstanley on Electronic Intifada, so there's very much a UK link there as well. I've no doubt this is all coordinated, and it's really interesting that Richard Medhurst, of course, who's been interested in Austria and charged with actually being a member of Hamas, which is laughable, is one of the people who the UN have intervened about. He's one of the people in the UN letter whose case the UN have taken up. So there's a doubling down there.